The deed was placed upon the long oak table in the steward's office at Ashworth Hall, and every man in the room looked at it as though it carried a disease. It was a single sheet of heavy cream paper bearing the Calder crest, stamped and signed in the Duke's own hand. Below the signature, a list of conditions had been set down in the chief steward's precise, angular script. They were not generous conditions. They were the terms of an exile dressed in the language of a gift. The property known as Bracken Moor, comprising 400 acres of open fell, 60 acres of enclosed pasture, a farmhouse, 3 tenant cottages and associated outbuildings, is hereby granted on a probationary lease of 12 months to the applicant, one Nella Thorne, widow of no fixed parish. The room was warm. A fire burned in the grate despite the mildness of the September afternoon, and the air smelled of tallow and ink and the particular mustiness of documents that governed other people's lives. 4 men stood around the table. Mr. Carveth, the chief steward, occupied the chair behind the desk as though it were a throne. He was a lean man with a narrow, fox-like face and eyes the color of wet slate. He did not touch the deed. He regarded it with the particular composure of a man who is calculating, rapidly and invisibly, how a new circumstance might be turned to his advantage, or how it might threaten him. Beside him stood Thomas Howe, the under-steward, a florid, broad man whose discomfort was written plainly across his ruddy features. Behind them both, 2 estate clerks hovered like nervous birds, their quills idle, their expressions caught somewhere between curiosity and alarm. And across from them all, standing on the other side of the desk with her hands clasped in front of her, was the woman. She was slight. That was the first thing anyone noticed about her. Slight and pale, with dark hair drawn back beneath a plain bonnet and a face that might have been carved from ivory. She wore a dress of faded brown wool, mended neatly at the cuffs, and she carried no luggage beyond a single leather satchel slung across one shoulder. She looked like precisely what she claimed to be, a widow of modest means, unremarkable in every visible respect. The only thing that set her apart from any other petitioner who had ever stood in this office was her stillness. She did not fidget. She did not shift her weight or lower her gaze. She simply stood, composed and watchful, as though she were the one conducting the interview rather than the one being assessed. Carveth read the conditions aloud. His voice was flat and unhurried, the voice of a man who wished it understood that his authority, not the Duke's signature, was the true power in this room. No funds shall be drawn from the ducal accounts for the maintenance, repair, or improvement of Brackenmore. No laborers, tenants, or tradesmen currently in the employ or service of the Ashworth estate shall be redirected to the property. The leaseholders shall bear all costs of restoration from her own resources. He paused and looked up at her, a thin smile on his lips. The leaseholder shall submit quarterly reports on the condition and yield of the property to the chief steward. All matters concerning Brackenmore shall be conducted solely through the steward's office. There shall be no cause for the leaseholder to approach or petition Ashworth Hall directly. Another pause. The final condition. Should the property fail to produce a measurable and sustainable yield within the 12-month probationary period, the lease shall be considered forfeit and the leaseholder shall vacate without claim or compensation. The silence that followed was thick and expectant. Howe, the under-steward, cleared his throat. He looked at the woman with something close to pity. "You understand, Mrs. Moss." "Thorne," he said carefully, "that Brackenmore has not produced a yield in nearly 3 years. The last tenants left of their own accord. The farmhouse roof has not been repaired since Lady Rosabelle," he faltered on the name, glancing at Carveth, "since it was last occupied. The land is waterlogged, the fences are down, there is no functioning well." "I understand," she said. Her voice was quiet but clear, with a steadiness that seemed at odds with the enormity of what she was agreeing to. She might have been accepting an invitation to tea. Howe shook his head slowly. "It is a dead place, Mrs. Thorne. Then it has nothing to lose." Carveth's thin smile tightened. He slid the deed across the table towards her, along with a pen. "Sign here," he said. "And here." He watched her sign with the particular attention of a man looking for trembling hands, for hesitation, for any sign of doubt he might later exploit. He found none. Her hand moved across the paper in a smooth, unhurried script. She set the pen down and straightened. "When may I take possession?" "Immediately," Carveth said. He did not rise from his chair. He did not offer his hand. "A cart has been arranged to take you and your belongings to the property." He let his gaze travel over her single leather satchel with undisguised contempt, such as they are. Something flickered in her gray-green eyes. It was not shame. It was something harder, something that surfaced and submerged so quickly that only a man who was watching very closely would have caught it. Carveth was watching closely. He saw it. And for just a moment the faintest crease of unease crossed his narrow face. She picked up her copy of the deed, folded it precisely, and placed it inside her satchel. "Thank you, Mr. Carveth," she said. "I shall send my first report at the quarter." She turned and walked out of the office without looking back. The door closed softly behind her. In the silence that followed, Howe exhaled slowly and rubbed his jaw. "She will not last a month," he said. Carveth did not answer immediately. He was staring at the door through which she had vanished, his fingers drumming a slow, irregular rhythm on the surface of the desk. "No," he said at last, his voice very quiet. "She will not." But there was something in his tone that was not certainty. It was the faintest vibration of a string that has been plucked without warning, and it troubled him because he could not yet identify what had plucked it. 3 floors above the steward's office, in a window that overlooked the gravel forecourt, a figure stood motionless against the glass. Hadrian Calder, 9th Duke of Ashworth, watched a slight woman in the brown dress emerge from the servants' entrance and walk towards the waiting cart. He watched her climb up onto the bench beside the driver without assistance, her satchel balanced on her knees. He watched the cart lurch forward and begin its slow progress down the long drive, carrying her towards the edge of his lands and the wild, ruined place that everyone in the county called cursed. He did not know why he was watching. He had approved the lease as a matter of administrative convenience, a minor notation in the margins of an estate ledger that ran to 400 pages. Brackenmore was a burden. It drained funds, produced nothing, and served only as a monument to a grief he could not bear to examine. When Carveth had brought him the woman's petition, he had read it once, felt a flicker of grim amusement at the absurdity of anyone wanting such a place, and signed the deed without discussion. "Let her have it," he had said, not looking up from his papers. "It cost us nothing." Now, watching the cart grow smaller against the gray September landscape, he felt a twinge of something he could not name. Not guilt, precisely. Something adjacent to it. The cart disappeared behind a line of elms, and the forecourt was empty again. He turned from the window and went back to his desk. The desk was a fortress of papers and ledgers, and he had been behind it in one form or another for the better part of 2 years. Since Rosabelle, he did not think her name so much as feel it, a pressure behind his sternum, a constriction in his throat. His younger sister, his bright, laughing, impossibly stubborn younger sister, who had insisted on riding out to Brackenmore in the dead of winter to tend to a sick tenant's child, who had caught the fever herself, who had died in that broken farmhouse on a bed with no proper linens, before word had even reached him at Ashworth Hall. He had shut the place up the day after her funeral. He had forbidden anyone from speaking of it. He had handed its management entirely to Carveth and turned his attention to the parts of his inheritance that did not carry the scent of death. And now he had given it to a stranger, a widow with no money, no connections, and no apparent understanding of what she was walking into. It was, he told himself, not his concern. She had signed the terms, she had accepted the conditions. Whatever happened to her at Brackenmore was her own affair. He picked up his pen and returned to the column of figures before him. The numbers would not hold still. They blurred and reformed, and behind them, like an image pressed into glass, He kept seeing the woman's face as Howe had described the ruin of the estate. Calm, unafraid, almost expectant. Then it has nothing to lose. An odd thing to say. An odd woman altogether. He shook his head, dipped his pen, and forced himself to write. The cart reached Brackenmore at dusk. Nella Thorne climbed down from the bench and stood for a long time in what had once been the front yard of the farmhouse, looking at the place that was now, for 12 months at least, hers. The driver, a taciturn man named Jessup who had not spoken a single word during the 7-mile journey, unloaded her satchel and a small crate of provisions that Howe had arranged, the only kindness anyone at Ashworth Hall had shown her. He set them on the muddy ground, touched his cap and drove away without ceremony. She was alone. The farmhouse was worse than she had expected, and she had expected a great deal. The roof sagged dangerously over the eastern end, its slate tiles scattered across the yard like falling teeth. The windows on the ground floor were intact, but so crusted with grime that they admitted almost no light. The front door hung at an angle on a single hinge. Beyond it, she could see a hallway thick with dust and dead leaves, and beyond that a kitchen whose hearth was black and cold and had not held a fire in what looked like years. The 3 tenant cottages, visible as dark shapes against the fell, were in similar states of abandonment. One had lost its roof entirely. The stone walls of the paddock had collapsed in several places, and the fields beyond were a wilderness of bracken, thistle, and standing water. The land itself seemed exhausted, saturated, defeated by neglect in the relentless northern rain. She set her satchel down on a flat stone by the door and took a slow, deliberate breath. The air was sharp and clean and carried the scent of peat and wet grass and the distant mineral tang of the fell. It was the smell of her childhood, the smell of home. For this was not the first time Nella Thorne had stood in this yard. She was not Nella Thorne. Her name was Tamsin Lee, and she'd been born in this farmhouse 26 years ago, in the upstairs bedroom with the slanted ceiling and the view of the tarn. Her father, Edmund Lee, had been the land agent of Brackenmore for 15 years, serving the old Duke, Hadrian's father, with a loyalty and competence that had been the foundation of the estate's modest prosperity. Under Edmund's care, the fields had been drained and planted, the cottages repaired, the tenants well housed and fairly treated. Brackenmore had not been wealthy, but it had been whole, a living, working, breathing piece of land. Then Edmund Lee had been accused of embezzlement. The accusation had come from Carveth, then a rising junior steward with sharp ambitions and a talent for making himself indispensable to the aging Duke. Carveth had produced doctored ledgers, falsified receipts, and the testimony of 2 clerks who owed their positions to him. Edmund, a quiet man more comfortable with soil than with politics, had been overwhelmed. His protests had been dismissed. His appeals had gone unheard. The old Duke, by then ill and increasingly dependent on Carveth's management, had believed his steward over the man who had served him faithfully for more than a decade. Edmund Lee had been stripped of his position, ejected from the farmhouse with his 12-year-old daughter, and turned over to the magistrate. He had died in a debtor's prison in Carlisle 18 months later, broken, not by the imprisonment but by the betrayal, by the knowledge that the man who had stolen from the estate had blamed it on the man who had tried to protect it. Tamsin had been 14 when her father died. She had survived on the charity of a distant aunt in Lancashire, a woman who had provided shelter but little warmth. She had educated herself with ferocious discipline, reading every book she could find on agriculture, land management, botany, animal husbandry. She had worked as a governess, a seamstress, a dairymaid on 3 separate farms, absorbing the practical knowledge that her father's books had given her in theory. She had been patient, she had been methodical, and she had never, for a single day, stopped planning her return. She had not come to Brackenmore merely to restore a ruined estate. She had come to find the original ledgers, the real accounts that her father had kept, the ones that would prove Carveth had falsified the records. She knew they existed. Her father had told her, in his last letter from prison written in a hand that shook with fever and despair. "I hid them, Tamsin. The true books. They are in our house. Carveth will never think to look because he believes I am too honest to have been cunning. Find them. Clear my name." She had carried that letter for 12 years. It was in her satchel now, folded so many times along the same creases that the paper had become soft as cloth. The true books were somewhere in this farmhouse, in the walls, beneath the floors, inside the chimney breast. Somewhere her father, a man of no great imagination but immense practical intelligence, had concealed the evidence of his own innocence and another man's guilt, and Carveth, who now sat in the chief steward's chair at Ashworth Hall, who had risen to a position of almost unchecked authority over every acre and every tenant and every penny of the Duke's vast holdings, had no idea that the daughter of the man he had destroyed had just walked back through the door. That was the advantage she carried. Her anonymity. Nella Thorne was a ghost, a name on a deed, a widow of no consequence. Nobody at Ashworth Hall had looked at her face and seen Edmund Lee's daughter. Nobody remembered the quiet girl who had left Brackenmore in a borrowed cart with a cardboard suitcase and no shoes that fit. Nobody except perhaps the land itself. Prox. She picked up her satchel, pushed open the broken door, and stepped inside. The first night was the hardest. She slept on the floor of the kitchen, wrapped in the single blanket from her crate of provisions, her back against the wall and the broken door propped shut with a chair. The farmhouse groaned around her, its timbers shifting in the wind, its walls ticking with damp. Rain came in through the damaged roof and pooled on the flagstones in the hallway. She listened to a drip in the darkness, a slow, relentless percussion, and she thought of her father. He had loved this place. He had walked every inch of these 400 acres, knew every drainage ditch, every boundary stone, every tenant by name and by need. He had taught Tamsin to read the land the way other fathers taught their children to read books. The color of the soil told you its health. The angle of the water told you where to dig. The behavior of the animals told you what the weather would do before any barometer could. She closed her eyes and let the sounds of the house settle around her. Tomorrow, she would begin. She would clear the kitchen, repair the door, assess the roof. She would walk the fields and catalog the damage. She would begin the slow, patient, back-breaking work of bringing this place back to life. And in the quiet hours when the work was done, she would search. She slept lightly, and she dreamed of her father's hands turning the pages of a ledger, his careful figures marching in neat columns across the page. Dawn came gray and cold. She rose, ate a heel of bread and a strip of dried meat from her provisions, and stepped outside into a morning that was all mist and silence. The fell stretched away in every direction, a vast rolling expanse of bracken and heather, its colors muted to shades of gray and brown and dull green. The tarn, a dark oval of still water half a mile to the north, lay like a mirror under the low sky. She had been standing in the yard for perhaps 5 minutes, surveying the collapsed paddock wall, when she heard it. A sound that did not belong to the wind or the rain or the distant bleating of fell sheep. It was a sharp, percussive crack, followed by a high, ringing cry that split the morning air like a blade. She turned towards the sound. It came from beyond the ruined paddock, from a stretch of rough ground that sloped upward towards the fell. She walked towards it, her boots squelching in the mud. She climbed over the broken wall and crossed a field of thistles and standing water. And then she saw her, a horse, a mare to be precise, standing alone on the open, fell about 200 yards ahead. She was tall and lean, with a coat the color of wood smoke and a mane that the wind had tangled into wild gray ropes. She was beautiful in the way that wild things are beautiful, with a fierceness that had nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with survival. She stood with her head high and her ears pricked forward, every line of her body taut with a wary, restless energy. Tamsin stopped. She knew this horse, or rather, she knew of her. This was solace. Lady Rosabelle's mare, the horse that had been the Duke's sister's most treasured companion, a gift from their father on her 16th birthday. The horse that, according to every account Tamsin had been able to gather in her months of careful research, had gone utterly wild since Rosabelle's death. She had thrown the groom who tried to stable her. She had broken through 3 separate paddock fences at Ashworth Hall. She had bitten the stable master so badly he still carried the scar on his forearm. Eventually, the Duke had ordered her released onto the fell. "Let her go," he had reportedly said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "She belongs to no one now, and solace had come here, to Brackenmore, to the place where her mistress had died." The mare saw Tamsin at the same moment Tamsin saw her. Her head swung around, nostrils flaring, and she let out another cry, half whinny, half scream, a sound of pure challenge and defiance. Her front hoof struck the ground, sending up a spray of mud. Tamsin did not move. She did not raise her hand, or call out, or take a single step forward. She simply stood in the wet field, the wind pulling at her shawl, and looked at the horse. She breathed slowly. She let herself become still in the way her father had taught her, the deep stillness of someone who understands that animals do not trust words, only presence. 1 minute passed. 2. Crowed. The mare's ears flicked forward, then back, then forward again. Her nostrils worked, testing the air. The challenge in her posture began to soften, not into submission, but into curiosity. A question where there had been a demand. She took a step forward, then another. Her hooves were nearly silent on the wet ground. She approached at an angle, not directly, the way a cautious creature approaches something it cannot yet categorize. She stopped 10 feet away, her dark eyes, enormous and liquid, fixed on Tamsin's face with an intensity that was almost human. Tamsin remained perfectly still. She could feel the horse's breath now, warm and grassy, carried on the morning air. "Cess." She could hear the soft rumble of the mare's breathing, see the fine tremor in her flanks. This was not a dangerous animal. This was a grieving one. A creature who had lost the only person she trusted and who had come back to the last place that smelled of her, and who had been waiting, for 2 long years, for someone to stand still long enough for her to remember what gentleness felt like. The mare stretched her neck and touched her muzzle to Tamsin's shoulder. The contact was light, barely there, the faintest pressure of warm velvet against rough wool. A question, a test. Tamsin exhaled slowly. She did not lift her hand. Not yet. She simply stood accepting the touch, letting the horse decide. Solace let out a breath of her own, a long, shuddering exhalation that seemed to carry the weight of seasons. She lowered her great head and rested it, lightly, against Tamsin's chest. They stood like that in the silent, mist-shrouded field, the wild horse and the woman who was not who she claimed to be, and neither of them moved for a very long time. 7 miles away, in the warm, lamp-lit stable yard of Ashworth Hall, the head groom was discovering that the mare's stall was empty again. The gate had been kicked clean off its hinges. Fresh hoof prints led across the south pasture, through the broken fence line, and out onto the open fell. Heading north, towards Brackenmore, he muttered under his breath, and went to report the escape to Mr. Carveth. It was the 4th time in 2 months. The steward would not be pleased, and when Carveth was displeased, someone always paid for it. The order arrived at Brackenmore 3 days after Nella had signed the lease. It came not by post but by hand, carried by Carveth himself, who rode up the muddy track on a tall black gelding. With the air of a magistrate arriving to deliver a sentence, he was accompanied by the head groom, a broad, weathered man named Kellard, and 2 stable hands who led a string of ropes and halters. Nella was on the roof. She had spent the morning stripping the damaged slates from the eastern end of the farmhouse, stacking the salvageable ones in neat piles, and discarding the shattered remnants. Her hands were cut, and her dress was streaked with grime, and she was balanced on the exposed timbers with a sureness of foot that suggested she had done this kind of work before. She saw the riders approaching from half a mile away, their dark shapes moving across the gray fell like pieces on a board. She climbed down and was standing in the yard, wiping her hands on her apron, when Carveth reined in his horse and dismounted. He did not greet her. His sharp eyes swept the property, cataloging the small changes she had already made. The cleared yard, the front door, rehung on new hinges, the pile of sorted slates. His expression did not change, but something tightened behind his eyes, a recalibration. Then his gaze found what he had come for. Solace was standing at the far edge of the paddock, her smoky gray coat almost invisible against the fell behind her. She was cropping grass near the broken wall, her tail flicking lazily, her posture one of deep and unaccustomed calm. She looked, Nella realized with a sharp pang, like a horse that had found a place to rest. Carveth stared at the mare. Then he turned to Nella, and his voice, when it came, was ice. "You have been handling the Duke's horse." It was not a question. Nella met his gaze steadily. "I have not, Mr. Carveth. She comes and goes as she pleases. I have not touched her, fed her, or confined her. I have no means to do any of those things." Carveth's jaw tightened. The mare was a source of considerable embarrassment to him. Her repeated escapes from the Ashworth stables reflected poorly on his management, and her apparent preference for this desolate place, the place where the Duke's sister had died, carried an emotional weight that he found both inconvenient and vaguely threatening. Sentiment was an unpredictable force. It made people look at things too closely. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document sealed with the estate's stamp. "This is a formal directive from the steward's office," he said, holding it out to her. "The mare known as Solace is the property of His Grace the Duke of Ashworth. She is not to be approached, handled, fed, sheltered, or addressed by any person not authorized by the head groom. Should the animal be found on the Brackenmore property, you are to send immediate word to Ashworth Hall and take no action of your own. Any interference with the animal will be treated as interference with ducal property and will constitute grounds for the immediate termination of your lease." Nella took the document. She read it carefully, her face betraying nothing. The other staff at Ashworth Hall had speculated about her with the particular relish that servants reserve for a newcomer who has been set up to fail. They called her the ghost tenant. They wagered on how many weeks she would last. But among their gossip, a thread of grudging curiosity had begun to emerge. She had not complained. She had not come begging for help. She had not, as everyone expected, collapsed under the weight of what she had taken on. The steward's office had received no letters, no petitions, no pleas. Just silence, and silence, in a household that ran on whispered intelligence, was deeply unsettling. "I understand," Nella said, folding the document and placing it in the pocket of her apron. Carveth waited, as he had waited in his office on the day she signed the lease, for some flicker of distress, some crack in her composure that he could file away for later use. He found none. "Kellard," he said, not taking his eyes from her. "Collect the mare." What followed was a display that might, under different circumstances, have been comic. Kellard and his two stable hands spent the better part of an hour trying to approach Solace. The mare, who had been docile as a lamb in the field, transformed the moment the men came near. She wheeled and bolted, her hooves throwing up great clods of mud. She jumped the broken paddock wall with an ease that left the stable hands shaking their heads. She circled the farmhouse at a flat gallop, her gray mane streaming, and twice she came to a stop within a few feet of Nella, standing quietly by the door before Kellard's approach sent her flying again. It was Nella who ended it. She walked into the field alone, slowly, her hands at her sides. The mare saw her and stopped. Nella did not reach out. She did not call. She simply stood as she had stood on that first morning, and breathed. The great gray head lowered, the velvet muzzle found her shoulder, and the mare was still. Nella placed her hand, very gently, on the halter that Kellard had managed to clip onto the mare during one of his failed approaches. She looked at the horse for a long moment. Then she turned and led Solace across the field towards the waiting groom, the mare following her with the trusting, unhurried steps of a creature that had made its choice. Nella handed the lead rope to Kellard. She did not look at Carveth. She did not watch as the men led the mare away, Solace's protesting cries echoing across the fell like a lament. She went back to the roof and resumed her work, her hands finding the rhythm of the slates, her face turned away from the track and the retreating figures and the sound of the horse she had been forbidden to love. Carveth watched from his saddle for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned his horse and followed his men back towards Ashworth Hall. He did not look back, but Kellard did. The head groom glanced over his shoulder as they crested the first rise, and he saw the woman standing on the roof of the ruined farmhouse, small and motionless, against the vast gray sky. And even from that distance he could see that her hands had stopped moving. She was looking north, towards the track, towards the diminishing shape of the horse. Kellard was not a man given to sentiment. He had worked with animals for 30 years and had long ago learned to separate affection from duty. But something about the scene disturbed him. The still figure on the broken roof, the crying mare at the end of his rope. It felt wrong. It felt like something being torn that ought to have been left whole. He mentioned it to no one. But that night, in the servants' hall at Ashworth Hall, when the talk turned to the ghost tenant and the wild mare and the steward's new directive, he kept his silence. And when someone asked him what the woman at Brackenmore was like, he thought for a moment and said only 2 words. "She's real." Nobody knew quite what he meant, but it stayed in the air, and it traveled, as things do in a great house, from mouth to ear to mouth again, until it reached a room 3 floors above the servants' hall, where a man sat alone at a desk, piled with papers he could not bring himself to read. The Duke came to Brackenmore on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after the lease had been signed. He told himself it was an inspection. The quarterly report was not yet due, but he was within his rights as landlord to assess the condition of his property at any time. That was the reason he gave Howe when he ordered a horse saddled. That was the reason he held in his mind as he rode the 7 miles across the fell, the October wind sharp against his face, the sky a low ceiling of iron-gray cloud. It was not the real reason. The real reason was the groom's words repeated to him by Howe in a tone of mild bewilderment. "She's real," a strange thing to say about a person. Everyone was real. And yet Hadrian understood, with an instinct he did not care to examine, exactly what Kellard had meant. In a house, in a world, governed by performance and position and the careful management of appearances, the word carried a weight that was almost revolutionary, real, unperformed, true. He had also heard through the quiet channels of household intelligence about the scene with the mare, how the wild, unmanageable Solace had gone, still at the woman's touch. How she had led the horse to the groom without a word, and then turned back to her work as though nothing had happened. And how, according to Kellard, the mare had refused to eat for 2 days after being returned to the Ashworth stables, and had broken out again within the week, heading north, always north, towards the broken estate and the woman who lived there. He saw the smoke before he saw the house, a thin gray ribbon rising from the farmhouse chimney, the first sign of life Brackenmore had shown in years. As he crested the last rise, the whole property came into view, and he pulled his horse to a stop. He had been here once since Rosabel's death, in those first terrible days when the house had still smelled of sickness and the bed in the upstairs room had still held the impression of her body. He had stood in the yard and felt nothing but a howling emptiness, a black wind blowing through the center of him. He had ordered the place sealed and had ridden away and had not looked back. Now he looked. The farmhouse was still rough, still worn, still scarred by years of neglect. But it was no longer dead. The roof over the eastern end had been partially rebuilt, new timbers pale against the old. The windows had been cleaned and he could see firelight through the glass. The front door stood upright on its hinges. The yard had been cleared of debris, and against the south-facing wall, a row of wooden frames had been erected, young plants visible beneath their protective coverings. The paddock wall had been repaired in sections, new stones fitted against old with a careful, practiced hand. It was not a transformation, not yet. It was something more modest, and to his eye, more remarkable. It was evidence of labor, relentless, solitary, intelligent labor. One woman, with no money and no help, taking a dead place and refusing to let it stay dead. He dismounted and led his horse into the yard. The front door opened and she stepped out. She was thinner than he remembered from the steward's office. Her face was tanned and wind-roughened, her hands red and calloused. Her dress, the same faded brown wool, had been patched in new places. She looked, he thought, like a woman who had been in a fight with the land itself, and who was, improbably, winning. "Your Grace," she said, her surprise controlled but visible. She curtsied, a movement made awkward by the heavy work boots she wore. "I was not expecting an inspection." "It is not an inspection," he said, and then stopped, because he did not know what to call it if it was not that. He looked around the yard, taking in the details he had seen from the ridge. "You have been busy, Mrs. Thorne. There is a great deal to do," she said simply. He nodded. He wanted to say more, but the language of his station, the careful formalities that governed every interaction between a duke and a tenant, felt suddenly inadequate. He was not here to assess drainage or count fence posts. He was here because a groom had called this woman real, and because a wild horse had chosen her, and because for 6 weeks the image of her face in the steward's office, the calm, watchful resolve with which she had accepted a death sentence, had lodged in his mind like a splinter he could not extract. "I understand the mare has been returning here," he said. Something shifted in her expression. A flicker of wariness, quickly suppressed. "She comes of her own accord, Your Grace. I have obeyed Mr. Carveth's directive. I have not approached her, fed her, or sheltered her. When she appears, I send word to the hall as instructed. And yet she comes," he said, his voice quiet. "Animals grieve in their own way, Your Grace. She lost her mistress here. Perhaps this is the only place that still feels like home to her." The words hit him with a force she could not have intended, or perhaps she could. He looked at her sharply, searching for calculation, for the subtle manipulation that he had been trained since childhood to detect in every interaction. He found nothing but a pair of steady, clear eyes looking back at him with an honesty that was almost painful. At that moment, as if summoned by the mention of her name, solace appeared at the crest of the fell behind the farmhouse. She had escaped again. Hadrian could see the broken halter rope trailing from her neck. The mare picked her way down the slope and entered the yard, moving past the Duke and his horse without a glance. She walked directly to Nella and stopped. The horse's great head turned towards the woman, and Hadrian saw in the animal's eyes the same expression he had seen in the eyes of his own hunting dogs when they found their master, after a long absence: recognition, relief, belonging. Nella did not touch the horse. Her hands remained at her sides, her fingers curling into fists with the effort of restraint. She looked at the Duke, and in that look was a question she would never speak aloud, a plea she was too proud to voice. "You are sending her away," he said. "It was not a question. I am obeying the directive, Your Grace." He stood very still, watching the woman and the horse, and he felt something shift inside him, a tectonic movement in the deep architecture of his grief. Rosabelle had loved this mare. Rosabelle had loved this place. And this woman, this stranger with her patched dress and her calloused hands and her incomprehensible determination, was standing here in the ruins of everything his sister had cherished, bringing it back to life and being punished for it. He thought of Carveth's directive. He thought of the steward's narrow, satisfied face, as he had presented it for signature. He had signed it without reading it, as he signed most of what Carveth put before him. He trusted the man. He had always trusted the man. Now, for the first time, a hairline fracture appeared in the foundation of that trust. He mounted his horse without another word. He rode back to Ashworth Hall in silence, the image of the woman's clenched fists burning behind his eyes. He went directly to his study, sat down at his desk, and for a long time did nothing at all. He simply stared at the wall and thought about a horse that kept running towards the one person she was forbidden to reach. That evening, he sent for Howe. The understeward appeared within minutes, his broad face ruddy from the kitchen fire. "The directive regarding the mare Solace," Hadrian said without preamble. "Who drafted it?" "Mr. Carbeth." "Your Grace, you signed it last month. Did I read it?" Howe hesitated, his loyalty to Carbeth visibly warring with his loyalty to the truth. "I could not say, Your Grace. Mr. Carbeth presented it with the other estate papers. There were a great many documents that day." Hadrian was quiet for a moment. "The quarterly reports from Brackenmore," he said. "Have any been received?" "The first is not due for another fortnight, Your Grace. When it arrives, I wish to see it myself. It is not to pass through Carbeth's hands first. It is to come directly to me. Is that understood?" Howe's eyebrows rose, but he nodded. "Understood, Your Grace." "And how?" "The groom, Kellard. He described Mrs. Thorne in a particular way. He said she was real." "What did he mean by that?" Howe considered the question with the careful seriousness of a man who knows that the wrong answer to a simple question can have complicated consequences. "I believe he meant, Your Grace, that she is not performing. That what you see is what she is." He paused, then added quietly, "Kellard has worked with animals his whole life. He says they know the difference between a person who is pretending and a person who is not. The mare does not pretend. Neither, he says, does Mrs. Thorne." Hadrian dismissed the understeward and sat alone in the gathering darkness. He did not light a lamp. Through the window, he could see the distant line of the fell, black against the deepening sky, and beyond it, invisible but present, the small farmhouse with its new chimney smoke and its cleaned windows, and its broken paddock where a wild horse kept returning to a woman who was forbidden to let her stay. Rosabelle would have liked her. The thought came unbidden and struck him with the force of a physical blow. He pressed his hand against his eyes and sat very still until the feeling passed. It did not pass entirely. It settled, like sediment in water, into a new and permanent layer of his awareness. Something was wrong at Ashworth Hall. He did not yet know what it was. But for the first time in 2 years, he was paying attention. Carbeth struck in November. The first blow was subtle. The supply cart that the village merchant had been sending to Brackenmore once a fortnight, carrying flour, salt, candles, and the few essentials Nella could afford, simply stopped coming. When Nella walked the 4 miles to the village to inquire, the merchant, a nervous man named Aldred, would not meet her eyes. "I cannot extend credit to Brackenmore," he said, busying himself with a display of tinned goods. "Mr. Carbeth has advised me that the lease is probationary and may not be honored." "I cannot take the risk. I pay in coin, Mr. Aldred," Nella said quietly. "I have always paid in coin." The merchant shook his head, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond her left shoulder. "I am sorry, Mrs. Thorne. I cannot help you." She bought what she could carry from a farm wife on the road home, a sack of oats, a block of hard cheese, a bundle of tallow candles, and walked back to Brackenmore in the rain. The second blow came a week later. The blacksmith in the village, a man she had engaged to repair a plow blade and forge new hinges for the barn door, sent word that he could not complete the work. No reason was given, but the reason was understood. Carbeth's shadow lay across every tradesman in the valley. The steward controlled the ducal contracts, and no smith, carpenter, or merchant could afford to cross him. The third blow was quieter, more insidious. Rumors began to circulate through the village and the tenant farms that bordered the Ashworth estate. The woman at Brackenmore was not what she seemed. She had been turned out of her last position for dishonesty. She had debts in 3 counties. She was involved with a married man, The stories were varied and contradictory, but their cumulative effect was precise. Doors that might have opened to Nella closed. Neighbors who might have offered a hand kept their distance. The tentative goodwill of the local community, the only resource she had beyond her own two hands, was being systematically poisoned. Nella understood the strategy. She had seen it before, had lived it before, 14 years ago, when Carveth had turned the same machinery of rumor and exclusion against her father. He was a man who destroyed, not with violence, but with isolation, who understood that a person cut off from community was a person already defeated. She did not defeat. She learned to do without the blacksmith. She heated her own forge from the old one in the barn, working the bellows with one hand and hammering with the other until her arms shook and her vision blurred. She repaired the plow blade herself, badly at first, then better. She walked twice as far to buy supplies from a market town beyond Carveth's reach, carrying her purchases on her back across the fell in all weathers. She ate less. She slept less. She worked until her body was a single sustained ache from dawn to dark, and the land responded. The drainage ditches her father had dug 15 years ago were still there, buried beneath the bracken and the accumulated silt of neglect. She found them one by one, cleared them, reopened them. The standing water in the lower fields began to recede. She turned the soil in the kitchen garden and planted winter vegetables, covering them with frames she built from salvaged timber. She repaired the barn roof and cleaned the stalls, and when a ewe heavy with lamb wandered onto her property from the open fell, she sheltered it and helped it through a difficult birth and kept the lamb. One became two. Two became a small, unlikely flock, gathered from strays and cast-offs that the fell farmers considered too weak to be worth collecting. She nursed them with the same patient, stubborn tenderness she applied to everything else, and they thrived, because they had never been given the chance to thrive before, and because the woman who tended them understood in her bones what it meant to be discarded and to survive anyway. Through it all, solace kept returning. The mare escaped from Ashworth Hall with a regularity that had become almost mythic among the stable staff. No fence held her, no stall contained her. She would appear at Brackenmore at dawn, her gray coat dark with dew, and stand at the edge of the paddock watching Nella work. And Nella, obedient to the directive she carried in her apron pocket, would not look at her. She would not call to her. She would continue her labor with her head bent and her jaw set, and the horse would stand and watch, and sometimes hours would pass before Solace would turn and drift back towards the fell of her own accord, only to return the next day, and the next, and the next. It was a small, daily heartbreak, witnessed by no one, and it cost Nella more than all of Carveth's sabotage combined, because the horse was not just a horse. Solace was a living thread connecting Tamsin to everything she had lost. Her father had helped raise this mare from a foal, had been the one to gentle her for Lady Rosabel's use. Tamsin remembered sitting on the paddock fence as a girl of 12, watching her father's patient hands on the young horse's neck, his quiet voice explaining that trust was not something you took from an animal but something you earned, slowly, through consistency and kindness and the willingness to be still. The horse remembered too. Tamsin was certain of it. Not her specifically, perhaps, but the quality of the stillness, the particular gentleness that Edmund Lee had passed to his daughter like an inheritance, more valuable than any deed or ledger. Solace came to Brackenmore not because she recognized Tamsin, but because she recognized something in Tamsin, the echo of a kindness she had known before in this place, from hands that moved the same way. And Tamsin could not answer her. She could not reach out. She could not offer the comfort that both of them needed, because a man sitting in a warm office on the far side of the fell had written a rule that forbade it, and that man held the power to take away the only chance she had of clearing her father's name. So she worked. She endured. She ate her meals alone in the kitchen. She had scrubbed clean, reading her father's letter by candlelight, tracing the shaking handwriting with her fingertip. And she searched. Every evening, after the day's labor was done, she spent an hour in the farmhouse, methodically examining the walls, the floors, the chimney breast. She tapped panels. She measured rooms, looking for discrepancies that might indicate a hidden space. She pried up loose flagstones and peered into the darkness beneath. She found mouse nests and rusted nails and a child's wooden horse that she recognized with a sharp intake of breath as her own left behind 14 years ago when they had been driven from this house in the space of a single morning. She held it in her hands for a long time. It was small and crudely carved, one of its legs broken. Her father had made it for her 5th birthday. She placed it on the mantelpiece above the fire and continued her search. She had not yet found the ledgers, but she had not yet looked everywhere. The farmhouse was old, its walls thick, its construction full of the idiosyncrasies of a building that had been modified and extended over 2 centuries. There were places she had not been able to reach, sections of wall she could not access, without tools she did not possess. The cellar, half flooded and choked with debris, remained unexplored. She would need time. She would need the winter to pass, the water table to drop, the ground to harden enough for her to clear the cellar stairs. She would need to survive Carvet's campaign of suffocation long enough to find what her father had hidden. And she would need to remain invisible. Because the moment Carvet understood who she really was, everything would be lost. The nights grew longer. The fell wind howled against the farmhouse walls. The first frost came in late November, painting the fields in white and turning the standing water to sheets of pale ice. Nella worked on, a solitary figure moving through the cold landscape, building, mending, planting, searching. And the horse watched from the fell, a gray sentinel against the gray sky, patient and faithful and waiting for a kindness that was not allowed to come. Lady Sefton, the Countess of Sefton, arrived at the hall on the 1st day of December, unannounced, and in a foul temper, brought on by the state of the roads. She was Hadrian's maternal aunt, widowed young and formidable ever since, and she had filled the role of family matriarch since his parents' deaths with a ferocity that brooked no argument. She was a small woman with a sharp tongue and eyes the color of polished steel, and she had run her own estate in Wiltshire with a competence that most men in the county privately envied and publicly resented. She had loved Rosabelle as fiercely as Hadrian had, and she had watched her nephew's retreat into grief with a growing impatience that she had, until now, kept to herself. She did not keep it to herself for long. Over dinner that first evening, she extracted from Howe, with the surgical precision of a woman who knew exactly which questions to ask, the full story of Brackenmore, the lease, the woman, the horse, and the steward's campaign of obstruction. Hadrian, seated at the head of the table, watched his aunt's face harden with every detail. "You gave a woman a ruined estate with no resources and no support," she said, setting down her fork with a deliberate care that signaled danger. "You allowed your steward to cut her off from every tradesman in the valley. You signed a directive forbidding her from comforting a grieving animal. And you have done nothing." "I visited the property," Hadrian said stiffly. "I have ordered the quarterly report to come directly to me." "How magnanimous," his aunt said, her voice dry as chalk. "You visited once and read a report. Meanwhile, this woman is rebuilding your land with her bare hands and being punished for it by your steward. In your name." Hadrian's jaw tightened. He had no adequate response because there was none. Every word was accurate. Lady Sefton arrived at Brackenmore the following morning, alone in a light carriage that she drove herself. Nella was in the barn, splitting kindling for the week when the sound of wheels on the frozen track brought her to the door. She had never seen the Countess before. She saw a small, imperious woman climbing down from a carriage with the agility of someone half her age, her sharp gaze already sweeping the property with the practiced eye of a landowner. "You are Mrs. Thorne," Lady Sefton said. It was not a question. "Your Grace." Nella curtsied, her surprise barely concealed. Lady Sefton did not waste time on pleasantries. She walked the property. She examined the drainage work, the kitchen garden, the repaired walls. She looked at the small flock of sheep in the paddock and asked intelligent, specific questions about their breeding and yield. She inspected the barn, the farmhouse, the new roof timbers. She said very little, but her silence was the silence of a woman who was revising a great many assumptions. They ended in the kitchen, where Nella served tea in mismatched cups, the only ones she had. Lady Sefton sat at the scrubbed table, her hands wrapped around the chipped earthenware, and studied the woman across from her with an intensity that made the air feel thin. "You know a great deal about land management, Mrs. X." "Thorne," she said. "More than any widow of modest means ought to know." "My father taught me," Nella said carefully. "Your father," Lady Sefton repeated. She looked at the mantelpiece, where a small carved horse sat beside a tallow candle. "And what was your father's profession?" Nella's hands stilled on her cup. The question was precise, aimed with the accuracy of an arrow. "He was a farmer," she said. Lady Sefton regarded her for a long moment. The fire crackled in the grate. Outside, the fell wind pressed against the windows. "My late brother-in-law, the old Duke, employed a land agent here at Brackenmore," she said conversationally. "A man named Lay, Edmund Lay. He was, by all accounts, a man of exceptional ability. He was accused of theft by the current steward, Mr. Carveth, and died in a debtor's prison." She paused. "He had a daughter. The girl vanished after his death. No one ever found her." The color drained from Nella's face. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Lady Sefton leaned forward. Her voice, when she spoke, was not accusing. It was gentle, almost tender. "You have his hands," she said softly. "The same long fingers, the same way of holding a cup, and you have his eyes. I met him once, you know, at a harvest dinner years ago. He struck me as the most honest man in the room." She reached across the table and placed her hand over Nella's trembling one. "I am not your enemy, child, but I must ask you, are you Edmund Lee's daughter?" The silence lasted a very long time. Nella's eyes filled with tears she had not shed in years, tears she had held behind a dam of discipline and purpose, and sheer, stubborn will. She could not speak, she could only nod. Lady Sefton squeezed her hand. "Then you are very brave," she said, "and you are in very great danger. Because if Carveth discovers who you are before you find what you are looking for, he will destroy you as surely as he destroyed your father." She stood, brushing down her skirts with brisk efficiency. "I will not tell my nephew. Not yet. That is your story to tell, when the time is right. But I will tell you this. Hadrian is a good man buried under a great deal of grief, and a steward who has been lying to him for years. When the time comes, he will listen. Trust in that." She left Brackenmore as briskly as she had arrived, her carriage disappearing down the track in a cloud of frozen breath. Nella stood in the kitchen doorway, shaking, her arms wrapped around herself. She had been seen. After 12 years of hiding, of erasing herself, of becoming someone small enough to escape notice. She had been seen, and it had not destroyed her. It had given her something she had almost forgotten existed. An ally. But Lady Sefton's warning echoed in her mind. If Carveth discovers who you are before you find what you are looking for. Time was running out. The cellar stairs had been cleared, but the cellar itself was still half flooded. The ground would not dry until spring, and spring was months away. She could not wait. There was another place to look. A place she had been avoiding because it meant leaving Brackenmore, crossing into enemy territory, and risking everything on a single desperate chance. The steward's office at Ashworth Hall. Her father's original ledgers might be hidden in the farmhouse, but the falsified ones, the doctored books that Carveth had used to frame him, would be in Carveth's own records. If she could find them, if she could compare Carveth's figures with what she knew of the estate's true finances from her father's letters and her own knowledge of the land, she could prove the fraud. She would have to go at night. She would have to be invisible. And if she was caught, There would be no second chance. We will take a very short break. If you do not want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. She waited for the darkest night of the month, a moonless Wednesday in mid-December when the sky was a blank of cloud and the fell was invisible beyond the farmhouse windows. She dressed in her darkest clothes, a threadbare black shawl over her brown dress, and left Brackenmore on foot at midnight. The walk to Ashworth Hall took nearly 2 hours in the dark, following tracks she had memorized from her visits to the village. The cold was bitter, the kind that sinks through wool and skin and settles in the marrow. Her breath plumed in the blackness. Her boots crunched on frozen ground. She reached the hall from the north, approaching through the service yard where the steward's office occupied a ground-floor wing. She had studied the building during her one visit to sign the lease. She knew which window belonged to Carveth's office. She knew it was secured by a simple latch, the kind that could be lifted with a thin blade. The yard was empty. The hall was dark and silent, its great mass of stone blacker than the sky behind it. She crossed the cobbles in a crouch, her heart a frantic percussion against her ribs. She reached the window, drew a kitchen knife from her belt, and worked the latch. It gave with a soft click that sounded, in the silence, like a gunshot. She eased the window open and climbed inside. The office smelled of leather and ink and something else, something sour and metallic, the scent of a man who sweated through his ambitions. She could see nothing. The darkness was absolute. She had brought no candle. Knowing that any light would be visible through the window, she would have to work by touch. She moved to the desk first, her fingers finding the edges of stacked papers, the cold metal of a lamp, the smooth surface of a writing slope. She opened the desk drawers one by one, carefully, silently. Correspondence, bills of sale, estate maps. Nothing that looked like old ledgers. She turned to the cabinet against the wall. It was tall and heavy, with glass-fronted doors that were locked. She used the knife again, working the small brass lock with a patience born of desperation. The door swung open. Inside, rows of leather-bound account books stood in chronological order. Her fingers walked along the spines, reading the embossed dates by touch. She counted backwards. 15 years, 16, 17. She pulled out a volume and opened it on the desk, running her fingertips over the pages, feeling the indentations of the ink, wishing desperately for light. She heard the footstep a fraction of a second before the voice. It was not a loud footstep. It was soft, almost inaudible, the sound of a leather sole on a stone floor. But in the profound silence of the sleeping house, it was unmistakable. Someone was in the corridor outside the office door. Nella pressed herself against the wall beside the cabinet, the ledger clutched to her chest. Her breathing stopped. The seconds stretched into an eternity of absolute paralyzing terror. The door handle turned. A figure filled the doorway, tall and dark against the faint gray light of the corridor. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then a match was struck, and a lamp flared to life, and Nella found herself looking into the face of Hadrian Calder, Duke of Ashworth. He was in his shirt sleeves, his dark hair disordered, his face sharp with sleeplessness. He had been in the library across the hall, unable to sleep, unable to work, unable to do anything. But think about the woman at Brackenmore and the questions that multiplied around her, like cracks in ice. He had heard the window latch give. He had come to investigate. He looked at her. He looked at the open cabinet, the ledger in her arms, the knife in her belt. His expression moved through shock, recognition, and a cold, controlled fury. "Mrs. Thorne," he said. His voice was quiet, the dangerous quiet of a man exercising immense restraint. "You are standing in my steward's office at 2 a.m. with a knife and a stolen ledger. I suggest you explain yourself." She could not speak. The words were there, all of them, the whole truth, her father's name, Carveth's crime, the hidden books, the 12 years of patient, furious planning. but they were trapped behind a wall of terror so thick she could not breathe past it. He took a step closer. The lamplight carved his face into planes of shadow and gold. She could see the vein pulsing at his temple, the tension in his jaw, the effort it was costing him not to shout. "Are you a thief?" "No," she whispered. "Then what are you?" The question hung between them like a blade. She looked at him, this man who held her future in his hands, this grieving, rigid, unknowingly decent man who had given her an estate nobody wanted, and had then watched, from a distance, as she fought to bring it back to life. She thought of Lady Sefton's words. "When the time comes, he will listen." "I am looking for proof," she said, her voice barely audible but steady. "Proof that your steward is a thief, and that my father was innocent." His face changed. The fury did not disappear, but something else moved beneath it, something searching and sharp. "Your father," he repeated. She held out the ledger. Her hands were shaking. "These are Carveth's accounts for Brackenmore from 15 years ago. The figures are wrong. I know they are wrong, because I know what this land produced, because I grew up on it, because my father was the man who worked it, your father's land agent, Edmund Lee." She swallowed hard. "My name is not Nella Thorne. My name is Tamsin Lay, and the man who sits in that chair destroyed my father with false numbers and books exactly like this one." The silence that followed was the most profound she had ever endured. She could hear the tick of the clock in the corridor, the creak of the ancient house settling around them, the wild hammering of her own heart. He took the ledger from her hands. He opened it. He looked at the columns of figures, at Carveth's angular script, at the entries that catalogued the finances of an estate that Tamsin knew, from memory and from love, down to the last drainage ditch and boundary stone. He closed the ledger. He looked at her for a very long time. "Go home," he said at last. His voice was rough, stripped of its aristocratic polish. "Go back to Brackenmore. Speak of this to no one. Leave the ledger with me." She had expected fury, accusation, the constable. She had not expected this. "Why?" she whispered. "'Cause I intend to read every ledger in this cabinet," he said, his eyes dark and unreadable. "And because if what you say is true, then a great injustice has been committed under my family's name, and I will not allow that to stand." She left through the window, as she had come. She walked the 2 hours back to Brackenmore in the freezing dark, her body numb, her mind on fire. She had shown her hand. She had told him her name. She was no longer invisible. Either she had just been saved, or she had just been destroyed. She would not know which until the morning. The morning brought Carveth. He arrived at Ashworth Hall at his customary hour of 8, hung his coat on the stand, and entered his office to find the Duke seated behind his desk. The cabinet doors were open. Every ledger from the past 20 years was stacked on the desk in neat chronological order. Carveth's face went the color of tallow. "Your Grace," he began. "Sit down, Mr. Carveth," the Duke said. He did not look up from the ledger before him. Carveth sat. His eyes moved rapidly over the scene, calculating, assessing, searching for the angle that would allow him to regain control of the situation. "These accounts," the Duke said, his voice conversational, almost pleasant, "show that Brackenmore produced a net loss in every year of Edmund Lee's tenure as land agent." He looked up. "That is what you told my father, is it not? That Lee was incompetent at best and dishonest at worst, that he was siphoning funds from the estate. That is what the figures show." "Your Grace," Carveth said carefully. Hadrian nodded slowly. He opened a second ledger, one he had found in the back of the cabinet, an older volume with a different binding. And yet this ledger, which appears to be a draft or working copy in a different hand, tells quite a different story. He held it up. "You kept it, I presume, as your reference, so you would know which figures to alter. 20 years in the back of your cabinet, you must have forgotten it was there. It shows Brackenmore producing a modest but consistent surplus under Lee's management. It shows drainage improvements, tenant repairs, livestock investments, all properly accounted for and all conspicuously absent from your final reports. He closed the book. Someone changed the numbers, Mr. Carveth. Someone took a functioning estate and, on paper, made it appear to be failing. And then someone accused the man who was running it honestly of stealing the money. That was never missing. Carveth's mouth opened and closed. The mask of professional composure was slipping, and beneath it, something ugly and cornered was beginning to show. That is a draft, Your Grace. It contains errors. The final accounts are the authoritative record. The final accounts, Hadrian said quietly, are in your handwriting, Mr. Carveth. The draft is in Lee's. He paused. I have spent the night comparing them, entry by entry. The discrepancies are not errors. They are systematic, deliberate. They tell a very clear story, and it is not the story you told. My father. He stood. He walked to the window and looked out across the estate, the manicured grounds, the prosperous farms, the orderly tenancies that Carveth had managed for 20 years funded. Hadrian was now beginning to understand, not by good stewardship alone, but by the systematic plunder of the one property nobody was watching. My aunt tells me that Edmund Lee had a daughter. He said his back to Carveth. A girl of 12 when he was arrested. She disappeared after his death. Carveth said nothing. His hands, resting on his knees, had begun to tremble. The woman I placed at Brackenmore, the Duke continued, his voice dropping to a tone that Carveth had never heard from him before, a tone of cold, measured, devastating clarity. The woman you have spent 3 months trying to drive away. The woman whose supplies you blocked, whose reputation you poisoned, whose every effort you sabotaged. He turned from the window. Her name is not Nella Thorne. Her name is Tamsin Lee. She is Edmund Lee's daughter. She came back to clear her father's name, and these ledgers prove that her father was telling the truth. The sound that came from Carveth was not a word. It was a low, involuntary exhalation, the sound of a man watching the structure of his entire life begin to collapse. You framed an innocent man, the Duke said. You stole from my family. You lied to my father on his deathbed. And when his daughter came back, you tried to crush her the same way you crushed him. He let the silence stretch. And you did it all from this chair with this pen and these books, wearing the face of a loyal servant. The door opened. Nella stood in the threshold. Howe had brought her from Brackenmore at the Duke's request, and she had come not knowing what she would find. She saw the ledgers on the desk. She saw Carveth's ashen face. She saw the Duke standing by the window with the winter light behind him, and in his eyes she saw something she had never dared to hope for. He believed her. Miss Leigh, the Duke said, and the name, her real name, spoken in his voice, in this room, in front of the man who had tried to erase it from the world, broke something open inside her that she had kept sealed for 14 years. She did not weep, not yet. She stood straight, her chin lifted, her hands steady at her sides, and she looked at Carveth with an expression that held no hatred, no triumph, only a vast and exhausted relief. Carveth made one final attempt. He half rose from his chair, his voice climbing to a desperate pitch. She is lying, Your Grace. She broke into this office last night. She is a trespasser and a fraud. I demand that she be arrested. Mrs. Thorne was at Brackenmore last night, the Duke said calmly. I know this because I rode there myself to inspect the property by lamplight. I do that from time to time. He held Carveth's gaze. A private habit, no witnesses. But I can assure you, she was there. The lie was delivered with the same quiet authority with which he conducted all his affairs. It was a wall of stone against which Carveth's accusation shattered and fell. The steward looked from the Duke to Tamsin and back again, and he understood, with the clarity of a man who has spent his life reading the currents of power, that he had lost. You will leave this house today, the Duke said. You will take nothing but your personal effects. The magistrate in Carlisle will receive a full account of the discrepancies in these ledgers, along with the documentation necessary to overturn the conviction of Edmund Lee. His voice hardened. Whether you face criminal prosecution will depend on the extent of what my solicitors uncover. I suggest you pray that my patience outlasts my anger. He turned to Tamsin. Your father's name will be cleared, Miss Lay. His record will be corrected. The property he was owed, the wages he was denied, the pension my family should have provided, all of it will be restored. He paused, and his voice, which had been the voice of a duke dispensing justice, softened into something more human, more hesitant, more real. I am sorry. My family failed yours. I failed yours. I gave you a ruined estate and called it generosity when it was negligence. You deserved better. Your father deserved better. Tamsin found her voice at last. My father loved this land, she said. He loved it enough to hide the truth inside it and trust that someone someday would care enough to find it. She looked at the ledgers on the desk, at the careful figures in her father's hand, the quiet arithmetic of an honest man. You found it. Your Grace, that is not negligence. That is justice. Carveth was escorted from the property within the hour. He left in a hired carriage with a single trunk, his face the color of old paper, his 20 years of careful corrosive authority erased in a single morning. The household watched in stunned silence. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The ledgers on the Duke's desk spoke for themselves. That afternoon, Hadrian rode to Brackenmore alone. He found Tamsin in the barn, mending harness as if the world had not just shifted on its axis. Solus stood beside her, the mare's great head resting on the wooden partition, her dark eyes half closed in contentment. The directive about the horse had been torn up that morning. He dismounted and stood in the barn doorway, suddenly uncertain. He was a man who had governed a vast estate, managed tenants and servants and magistrates, faced down creditors and rivals without a tremor. But standing in this barn, looking at this woman with her work-roughened hands and her steady eyes and her staggering courage, he found that the language of authority was useless to him. He needed a different language entirely, and he did not know if he possessed it. You should not be mending harness, he said. It was not what he had intended to say. She looked up at him, and for the first time she smiled. It was a small, tired, luminous thing, and it undid him completely. What should I be doing, Your Grace? Living, he said quietly, not surviving. Living. He did not say more. It was not the time. But he came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. He came to inspect drainage ditches and discuss crop rotation and argue about the best breed of sheep for fell grazing. He came with tools and timber and once, memorably, with a wagon load of slate for the roof, which he helped her lay himself, his fine coat abandoned on a fence post, his ducal hands blistered and bleeding. And slowly, through the shared labor and the honest conversation and the quiet accumulating hours, something grew between them that neither of them named, because naming it would have meant acknowledging how much they had both been missing and how much they both stood to lose. A year passed. Summer came to Brackenmore like a benediction. The fields, drained and turned and planted, blazed with barley and oats, their golden heads rippling in the warm wind. The kitchen garden overflowed with vegetables, herbs, and flowers that Tamsin had planted in the borders because, she said, beauty was not a luxury but a necessity for any place that intended to call itself alive. The farmhouse stood solid and handsome under its new slate roof, its windows gleaming, its stone walls washed in pale lime. Smoke rose from the chimney, and the scent of baking bread drifted across the yard. The 3 tenant cottages had been rebuilt and were occupied. Families that Tamsin had found in the surrounding villages, people who had been overlooked or turned away by other landlords, lived in them now, working the land alongside her, their children playing in the paddock where Solus grazed beside a young foal, sired by the Duke's own stallion, a gift that Hadrian had presented with a formality so stiff that Tamsin had laughed out loud the first time he had ever heard her laugh, and a sound he had been trying to provoke ever since. The flock had grown to 40 head. The barn housed 2 milk cows and a cart horse. A new well had been dug, and the water ran clear and sweet. The cellar, finally drained in the spring, had yielded its last secret. Behind a false wall that Edmund Lee had built with his own hands, Tamsin had found the original ledgers, every figure, every entry, every penny accounted for in her father's meticulous hand. They had been delivered to the magistrate in Carlisle. Edmund Lee's conviction had been formally overturned. His name had been cleared. Hadrian rode to Brackenmore on a Tuesday in July, as he did most Tuesdays and most Thursdays and, if he was honest, most days that offered any plausible excuse. He crested the rise and pulled his horse to a stop, and he looked at what lay before him, and he could not reconcile it with what he had seen a year ago. The dead place was alive. The cursed land was abundant. The estate that nobody wanted was, by any measure, the most beautiful and productive small holding in the county, and the woman who had done it was walking towards him across the sunlit yard, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her face tanned and open, Solus trailing behind her like a gentle gray shadow. She was no longer the thin, guarded figure in the faded brown dress. She was herself. Tamsin Lee, daughter of Edmund, the woman who had taken a ruin and a grievance and transformed them both into something whole. "You are staring, your grace," she said, shading her eyes against the sun. "I am," he admitted. "I am trying to understand how one person did all of this." "One person did not," she said. "You helped." "How helped?" "Kellard brought the foal. The Larkin family rebuilt the east cottage wall." She smiled. "Brackenmore was never dead, Hadrian. It was only alone. Everything grows when it is no longer alone." He dismounted. He stood before her in the warm July light, and he took her hands, her strong, capable, beautiful hands, the hands of her father, the hands that had rebuilt a world. "I have been alone for a very long time," he said. His voice was low, stripped of every pretense, every wall, every carefully maintained distance. "Since Rosabelle, since before Rosabelle, I have been alone in a house full of people, and I did not know it until you showed me what it looks like when someone refuses to be defeated by solitude." He lifted her hands and held them between his own. "I am not a man of grand gestures, Tamsin. I am slow and deliberate, and I have been told more than once that I have the romantic instincts of a fence post, but I know what I see when I look at you. I see the bravest person I have ever met. I see the woman who saved my land and my conscience, and quite possibly my soul. And I am asking you, not as a duke, not as a landlord, but as a man who has finally learned what it means to be honest. Will you stay, not at Brackenmore, with me as my wife?" She looked at him, this man who had given her a dead estate and watched her bring it back to life. This man who had lied to protect her, who had torn apart his own steward's office to find the truth, who had laid roof slates in the rain with bleeding hands and never once complained. This man who had learned, slowly and painfully and with the same stubborn determination she recognized in herself, how to feel again. "I have been waiting," she said softly, "for you to see that Brackenmore was never just about the land." He smiled. It was the full, unguarded, transformative smile she had seen only a handful of times, the smile that turned his severe face into something extraordinary, something warm, something that looked, she thought, like home. Solus, who had been standing a few feet away with the patient disinterest of a horse who has seen quite enough human foolishness for one lifetime, chose that moment to step forward and push her great gray head between them, her muzzle finding the space where their hands were joined. She let out a long, low breath, warm and grassy and content. Tamsin laughed, and Hadrian laughed, and the sound of it carried across the golden fields of Brackenmore, across the fell and the tarn, and out into the wide, bright, patient sky that had been waiting, as they all had, for the silence to finally break.